Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to our Friends of Europe Frankly Speaking podcast. Today it's with me, Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe for Peace, Security and Defence, and one of our regulars, my colleague in arms, Paul Taylor, also Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe for Peace, Security and Defence. And I don't really need to remind you, dear viewers, that Paul is also former diplomatic correspondent of Reuters and a columnist for Politico. Well, Paul and I are delighted to be back with you, but it's time to get back to business, and particularly focusing on our favorite topic, which is the war in Ukraine. So I wanted to begin today by asking Paul, what's been going on in the 6 weeks or so since you last heard our commentary? Has it been more of the same? Have there been significant changes or turning points? We're going to mark, sadly, 1 year of the war in Ukraine in just a couple of days' time on February the 24th. So I know that the question on everybody's mind is, where are we and where are we going in the future? So, Paul, can you kick us off today by helping us sort of look back in terms of what happened while we weren't commenting, and where do you see things going? Are we sort of sitting down now, regrettably, for a long war of attrition? Paul.
Well, Jamie, I think indeed the most significant developments in the war over the last couple of months have actually arguably been off the battlefield and not on it. It's settled down. It's moved from being a blitzkrieg, which failed, to a Ukrainian flash counteroffensive, which was pretty successful, in particularly around south of Kharkiv and in recapturing Kherson, to a Zitzkrieg, a war of, a static war, a war of attrition. And the Russians have been gone back to, almost World War One tactics of trench warfare, massive artillery barrages, trying to wear the Ukrainian army down, and using, of course, the Wagner Group military company, mercenaries, if you will, as very often as their shock troops, with very, very high casualties, as far as one can tell on the Russian side. Very hard to tell much about casualties on the Ukrainian side, because there seems to be a conspiracy of silence about that. Off the battlefield, I think the most significant developments have undoubtedly been the agreement by a number of Western powers to provide tanks, as well as a lot of other equipment, air defense equipment, ammunition, and longer range missiles as well, to Ukraine. And that, I think, in turn reflects perhaps a surprise for some people, the extent to which European and transatlantic unity has held firm. A lot of people thought that it would start to crumble in winter as this went on, as prices went up around the Western world because of the energy dislocation caused by the war and by the sanctions. That hasn't happened. On the contrary, I think that the Europeans and the Americans are more united now, or as united as they were at the start of the war. There's been a huge amount of media fuss, particularly beating up on Germany as the recalcitrant, reluctant, always late, always slow Western country that really needs to take the lead and get out there and get those Leopard tanks out there. And I think that's very ahistorical. I think it ignores, what is a very historically fraught decision for the Germans. It ignores the domestic politics in Germany and the checks and balances which exist in Germany's constitution. German chancellors are less powerful on these matters than American presidents or French presidents. And also, I think it's just, German bashing is always fun in the English language media. But the reality is, Germany, by the way it handled this, has kept the alliance together because it has brought the United States into the provision of tanks as well, which wasn't really on the agenda in Washington, and has shown, all for one and one for all.
Paul, thanks for that. We'll move on to the EU because, as you well know, as a regular commentator on EU affairs, there was this high-profile EU-Ukraine summit last week in Kiev with the head of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and the head of the Council, Charlie Michel, plus assorted commissioners and the EU High Representative, Josep Borrell, all traveling to Kiev. The press sort of presented it as a bit of an EU cold shoulder for Ukraine in terms of not setting a date, as President Zelenskyy has called for, to begin the accession negotiations, and not accepting Zelenskyy's idea of a faster track. And some media have said that, although the EU offered other things, the results were rather modest. I mean, is this your view? Do you think the EU is missing some great historical opportunity here to really sort of fast track Ukraine and maintain the spirit of the people in these difficult times? Are we being sort of too pernickety about, meeting all of the EU requirements, or do you think that basically the EU is following a sensible policy at the moment, and what the EU is actually doing for Ukraine is maybe more significant than seems sometimes to emerge from the media reporting?
Look, the EU and the United States jointly are holding Ukraine up. If they hadn't, it would have collapsed, despite the bravery of the Ukrainian armed forces. But at the same time, the Ukrainians have raised some unrealistic expectations, and it's not there comes a time when those unrealistic expectations collide with reality. And that time, I think, was last week at that summit, where the European Union smothered Ukraine in love, with their presence, with their declarations of support. But they tried to explain that joining the EU is a long and complex process. You have to adopt the entire body of EU law. You have to reform your institutions. You have to have the institutional capacity. You have to have the justice capacity. You have to have achieved things in the fight against corruption and so on. And that partly because of some quite difficult experiences with the countries of Central and Eastern Europe that joined the EU in 2004 and 2007, the EU is now insisting that there has to be a track record, proven track record of reform from all candidate countries. And no, they can't make an exception for Ukraine because of the war. And in fact, the war makes it harder for the Ukrainian authorities, the Ukrainian parliament maybe, to actually adopt and implement all of this EU law they're going to need to do. So there is no fast track. That's just the reality. There's no shortcut to EU membership. There are other things that can help Ukraine in this long, hard slog, and they will get all the help that they can. So the EU, what the EU's tried to do is to provide sort of, as it were, lots of intermediate goodies, like last week's decision to grant Ukraine free mobile roaming throughout Europe. These are things that make Ukraine's European future tangible and credible to ordinary Ukrainians. Next steps are that the Commission has to report on the conditions of Ukraine's EU accession process in its regular enlargement report in October. It won't be ready before, I think. And then a decision will come about whether and when to open negotiations. It's imaginable that that decision could be taken before the end of the year, but opening negotiations is just the start. There are countries in the Western Balkans that opened negotiations a decade ago and have still not got very far. So then it really depends on Ukraine's capacity. There's also a problem, we have to admit it, of the EU's ability to absorb Ukraine. It's a big country. It's not like a small Balkan country with 4 or 5 million people or less. This is a country with a population of 40 million. It's a very large agricultural producer, admitting allowing in its agricultural produce tariff-free, which has already happened as a gesture of support to Ukraine during the war, is squeezing European farmers and causing complaints as well. So it won't be easy. But the commitment to stay the course with Ukraine, I think, is there, and we'll see it again this week if, as has been leaked in Brussels by European Parliament officials, President Zelenskyy makes a visit to Brussels, only his second trip outside of Ukraine after his visit to Washington.
Washington, yeah.
And you'll expect to see him cheered in the European Parliament, welcome to the European Union summit at the end of this week. So there's lots of political support, there's financial support, but membership is going to take a long time. But let me ask you a question. We've heard all this news about Ukraine to receive new military equipment. Will it get there in time? And will these tanks and armored personnel carriers, do you think, make a decisive difference on the battlefield? And would fighter aircraft change the picture for that matter?
Yeah, thanks, Paul, for those questions. I certainly think that obviously the Ukrainians urgently need that armor, first of all, to protect themselves, because as you rightly said a moment ago, we don't have their battle casualty figures, but reading between the lines, it's clear that this fighting around Bakhmut and Solidar that you referred to, Paul, that's been going on has been taking its toll of Ukrainian troops, not just of Russians. The Russians may have lost more, but the Russians are losing sort of conscripts who have just joined the fight with little experience, whereas the Ukrainians are losing sort of battle-hardened quality troops, if I can put it that way, that they can ill afford to lose. So they definitely need the protection. And as the Russians, whatever the speculation about a spring offensive, have also dug themselves in with better defended lines of fortifications, they're definitely, you referred to World War I, going to need heavy armor to break through the barbed wire in the trenches if they're to have any hope of advancing. So I think, yes, this is definitely good news. But you're right. I mean, number one, will these extra assets arrive on time, particularly if the Ukrainians are serious about a spring offensive or to block a Russian offensive in the spring? That's an open question, because yesterday, for example, it was reported that Chancellor Scholz, in frustration, was phoning his Dutch and Finnish and other European counterparts saying, look, we've committed our tanks. You have indicated that you are willing to send yours, but you haven't made a commitment yet. So in terms of actual numbers, we don't know really where we stand. It's remarkable that by far the largest contingent will be coming so far with 31 tanks from the United States with the M1 Abrams, which the Americans didn't want to commit. When you look at the actual numbers from the European side, they're quite small. So you need a large number of countries to sort of join the Leopard 2 consortium if the Ukrainians are going to get anywhere close to the 300 that they say they need, and 600 armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles. So far, the numbers indicate that, at least if the Ukrainians are correct, that about 120, 130 have been committed. But you also know, Paul, very well that many countries like Portugal have acknowledged, and Spain, that their Leopard 2s have been mothballed, need to be repaired. Maybe they have to go to Germany first, to the German defense contractors like Krauss-Maffei-Wegmann or Rheinmetall to be refitted before they could be sent on. Then, of course, as you know, Paul, there are the questions of maintenance, of supplying ammunition. Tanks break down very easily, and therefore spare parts will be key. So the question is whether this sort of consortium of 12 European countries that has been mooted to look after the sort of supply, the maintenance, the sustainability of the tanks, whether that will be formed and really will work optimally. The two other things, you rightly mentioned air power. That's true. I mean, if you're a strategist and you've read enough books about warfare, Paul, to know this, armor requires air superiority, tactical air superiority, a control of the skies to be operationally effective. And if the Ukrainians aren't able to achieve this because they simply don't have the aircraft, then it's an open question whether the tanks and the other pieces of armor will be a war-winning asset. We'll have to wait and see just how quickly this aircraft issue is resolved. I mean, my sense is that we will have to provide aircraft, that there are probably interim solutions like Slovak Su-27s that are still in the NATO inventory, or German Learjets, or other kinds of aircraft that could be easier for the Ukrainians to operate and fill the gap. I would at least start the Ukrainians now on training, pilot training for F-16s, like Poland did in anticipation with Leopard 2 tanks, to at least prepare the ground. That doesn't prejudice a political decision. But yes, I think all wars were won when one party gained air superiority over the other party. That's been a doctrine of Western strategy for decades. The second thing is that if you remember the early stages of the war, Paul, you saw hundreds of carcasses of burnt out Russian tanks, T-72s, older generation T-62s, and so on, Russian armored personnel carriers. So obviously these things were highly, highly vulnerable to shoulder-fired missiles and mines and so on. The Leopards are top generation. They first appeared on the scene in 1979. The Leopard 1 tanks that the Germans say they will send are 1960s vintage. So one question I think for any strategist is, if the Soviet stuff was so vulnerable, what's going to make these Western tanks less vulnerable? How can they be employed in a way that guarantees their survivability, their functionality? I mean, clearly the key here is going to be the West's ability to train Ukraine in what's called combined arms operations, so that they integrate these assets behind some kind of winning strategy, and they don't simply leave their tanks as sitting ducks. I'll finish on this, but one interesting piece of news that I picked up last week, at least in terms of air defense, the Russians are, the Americans, please forgive me, that was a lapsus. The Americans are now developing a software which can integrate the various air defense systems that different countries have sent, Iris-Ts, Patriots, and so on, Hawks, into a sort of single operational system that will certainly make them effective. So the software, if you like, needs now to catch up with the hardware in terms of combined operations. And I think that's going to be a big challenge going forward as well. So yes, salute the tanks, but they are not a panacea in themselves.
Well, I'm sure that there's an awful lot more training going on than we're being told about. I mean, the European Union came up with an extraordinary figure last week. Joseph Borrell announced in Kiev that the EU had already trained 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers, and that they had a plan to train another 15,000 this year, which would, if accomplished, make the EU the biggest trainer of any, more than any individual country. But again, it begs a little bit the question of how long is the training, what are they being trained in, and how applicable is it really to the kind of high intensity warfare that now needs to be conducted.
Well, I think the spring, when everybody's anticipating an upsurge in military activity, although, as you rightly said, Paul, the war has hardly sort of stopped during the winter months. Indeed, the Russians have been very much on the offensive, but the spring will probably be the moment of truth when we see, who coming out of the winter, Ukraine with all of this military support from the West, Russia having used the winter, of course, to regroup as well as push the Ukrainians back in Donetsk, can be in a position to go further towards places like Sloviansk and Kramatorsk and all the rest, who really is going to come out of the racing blocks fast. But Paul, I need to ask you one thing in the time we have. I've been reading some pretty gloomy reports in the media this past week about the non-effectiveness of Western sanctions against Russia. The Russians have found workarounds. I suppose this was predictable. They found new customers for their energy. They're getting the Iranians to build drone producing plants for them in Russia itself. Lavrov is in Mali this week, having been in South Africa in recent days. So the Russians also seem to be conducting quite a visible sort of diplomacy to try to gain friends and sympathizers in Africa, in the Middle East, in the rest of the world. So what do you think is the staying power? Are the sanctions really working, but we just don't know about it? Or do you think we're in a situation where the sanctions have been overhyped and Russia probably has the means to keep this going for years to come, certainly longer than probably the Ukrainians would hope to be able to keep it going, particularly if that Western support does start to ease off in 2023 or possibly next year in 2024?
Well, you're right, Jamie, that the hit to the Russian economy has been less than was expected when the sanctions were initially adopted, and even as they've been ratcheted up. The Russian economy last year, according to the IMF, shrank by 2.2%. Now, you've got to compare that against the forecast growth before the war of 3% last year. But even if it's only a 5% overall contraction, it's still smaller, I think, than Western countries had hoped. And a lot of that is, of course, because Russia is so dependent on oil and gas exports. And the oil and gas prices were blown sky high by the war. And therefore, they're earning more per barrel. The EU and Western countries are trying different ways, both to wean themselves off Russian energy, which has been a remarkable success. I mean, the share of Russian gas in EU energy consumption has gone down from 40% before the war to below 9% now, and it's still falling. But yes, we've still got Russian gas in our storage, and when we run out of that, the challenge for us in the West, in Europe, is to be able to replenish it in time for next winter, and hope that this winter, which has been fairly mild so far, doesn't take too big a toll. But I think the hit to the Russian economy and indeed to the Russian military machine is a long-term hit. It's about the denial of technology. It's about the exodus of skilled technicians who were, building a high-tech economy in Russia, as on top of the traditional minerals, hydrocarbons sectors. And so, it's true that Russia has not, the Russian economy has not collapsed. They've been able to do some import substitution at home. China is, according to the Wall Street Journal, been providing some technological substitutes for the Russian defense industry. But the loss of access to key Western technologies, microchips and things like that, will be a long-term blow, as will the loss of skilled young manpower. And so, Russia may be facing another lost decade, but I agree that the hit may not be sharp enough to make a huge difference in the war, except that Russia will find it harder to replenish the precision-guided munitions, which it's basically run out of. And that, you're seeing improvisation on the Russian side, just as you are on the Ukrainian side. On Russian diplomacy, yes, they're trying to get back on the front foot. They were very isolated last year. They're going around trying to pick off the countries in Africa, which either have fond memories of Soviet support for their struggle against colonialism, or feel that Africa provides security and economic assistance with fewer strings attached than the EU, or where European intervention, such as in Mali, which you mentioned, has failed to produce a great improvement in the security situation, and they're now turning to the Wagner Group again. There's the same people who are fighting in Ukraine, and so all of that. I think you'll see. The Russians are trying to tee up a summit with China, where Xi Jinping, the president, would come to Russia this time, and that would be a big boost again politically for Russia if it happened. I think the Chinese, however, are still being careful about what they supply to Russia. They know the Americans are watching. They don't want to be hit by secondary sanctions.
Well, I think that, clearly moving forward, we've identified today this issue of the staying power of the West. Paul, you pointed out the cruciality of that support in keeping Ukraine alive. And what factors might be that could undermine it. I mean, it's been, as you rightly said at the beginning, surprisingly strong and sturdy thus far. I think the way in which President Zelenskyy moved very quickly and decisively in recent days to fire ministers, officials, provincial governors who might have were implicated or possibly implicated in corruption is a sign that he's wary that any bad news of Ukrainian malfeasance could risk, particularly with the US Congress, with the enormous sums of money it's allocated to Kiev, it could risk that that support. So he's clearly sort of nervous about that. The Republicans, it's difficult to call sometimes, because on the one hand, there are noises about checking on the funding and limits to the funding, but Republicans traditionally have been very supportive so far of the transfers of weapons. In Europe, I'm hearing more voices from opposition leaders, as well as some in the armed forces, pointing to the consequences of robbing Peter to pay Paul. In other words, leaving NATO naked by stripping it of some of its armor to send to Ukraine. I suppose as long as there's the perception that it's a good thing to do because the defense of the West is the defense of Ukraine, and if Ukraine is successful, NATO's task of collective defense is easier. I suppose for the time being that narrative is taking hold. But my sense, just in closing today, is that, like everything, it depends upon perception of the strategy working. And that it's worth it because we're seeing success. And the Ukrainians were certainly in that position at the end of the year when they regained the territory. You referred to that, and they seemed to be on the advance. And mighty Russia was no longer invincible. Russians could be beaten. That was a great encouragement. The strategy is working, so one more heave, let's keep it going. But my sense is that in 2023, the West is going to face a pretty crucial choice. Do we really believe that Ukraine can win? And even at risks of escalation with Russia, we're going to go all out in giving Kiev everything it needs to be successful. There's no way back, if you like, or will, if the fighting gets bogged down and stalemated, will Western countries maybe decide to cut their losses, think of looking after themselves and shoring up NATO, and maybe keeping some of that military equipment back and pushing Kiev towards peace negotiations. So my sense is that 2023 is a year in which much can happen and practically anything can happen. But anyway, some concluding thoughts from me. But Paul Taylor, once again, it's always great to be in a conversation with you on the podcast. Next time round, we will host the ambassador of Georgia to the European Union to widen our perspective in terms of how all of this is affecting Georgia at the moment. Paul will join me for that. That's next week, but it's great to be back. Look forward to many more podcasts. But again, thanks very much to Paul and his analysis today. Thanks to you, faithful viewers and listeners. And as I've said, back very, very soon. But from Brussels and from Saint-Rémy-en-Provence, it's goodbye from Paul and goodbye from me.
That's it for this Frankly Speaking podcast. Consider subscribing to our newsletter or following us on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, or Facebook. And don't forget to tune in again, this time next week.